She hit the ground before the sound caught up. The chopper was gone. Just rotor wash and flame drifting through the canyon air. Metal burned cold against her hands. Blood tasted like rust, and every breath carried the grit of torn earth. Captain Lillian Rhodes hadn't fallen from altitude. She'd been dropped by command, erased mid-transmission, left to vanish under orders that never existed. She counted the seconds, cataloged pain, found movement again. Survival wasn't instinct. It was procedure. The mission changed shape, but she didn't. Later, the files would call it containment. She called it truth. Drop a comment if you've ever felt the silence after impact. Subscribe to remember why we endure, because this wasn't about surviving the fall. It was about standing up in its aftermath. The desert woke in silence. A thin line of amber light broke across the Nevada horizon, catching the dust that drifted over the antenna field. The base sat quiet, its structures low and expressionless, shadowed against the pale glow. Only the steady hum of a distant generator hinted that the night had ended. The world felt organized, sterile, and obedient, everything in its place. But in the stillness between the wind and the radio static, something already felt wrong. Captain Erin Maddox stepped from the operations trailer just as the first wind brushed the tarmac. The air was dry enough to sting the eyes. She adjusted her uniform, smoothed the Velcro on her sleeve, and walked the line between communication towers. Her movements carried practiced precision, deliberate, unhurried, purposeful. Years of repetition had turned the early hours into ritual. Check the frequencies, log the transmissions, confirm the orders. Yet even ritual could falter under the weight of something unfamiliar. Inside the command center, the lights buzzed faintly. Screens flickered with encrypted bursts of green data. The air smelled of coffee and heated plastic. Maddox scanned the message queue, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read the newest incoming order. A classified directive marked Command Priority 1. No identifier, no authentication chain, no familiar code header. The call sign attached to it didn't belong to any division she recognized. Her gloved hand hovered over the console. Every instinct said to log it, forward it, move on. That was the process. Obey the signal, not the feeling. But she didn't move. The hum of the equipment seemed louder now, almost accusatory. The screen's glow painted her face with a pale blue light as she leaned in closer. The directive was short. Too short for a priority transmission, and written in language that felt deliberately vague. It mentioned asset retrieval, relocation, and immediate suppression of internal dissent. Maddox exhaled slowly. The room felt smaller. She keyed open the verification system, entering the cipher sequence twice, waiting for a response that didn't come. The system rejected the origin as non-standard. She rechecked the order header again. No seal, no traceable time stamp, nothing. And yet, it had traveled through the official relay. Someone, somewhere, wanted it to look legitimate. Outside, the rising light cut through the dust. Shadows stretched long against the desert floor, distorted and uneasy. Maddox stepped out into the open air again, scanning the line of vehicles parked along the perimeter fence. Marines moved quietly in the distance, silhouettes carrying out morning routines, unaware of what she'd seen. Her eyes caught on one of them, a corporal standing at attention, his flag patch sewn in reverse. The stars faced backward, as if pulled into the past. The image stayed with her longer than it should have. She walked back toward her quarters with the directive still on her tablet. The chain of command required her to forward it to the battalion S3 before 0700 hours. Procedure was clear, but the language replayed in her head. Internal dissent. Orders like that weren't for combat units. They were for control, for silence. At her desk, she opened the message one more time. The metadata showed nothing. Even the encryption header had been scrubbed clean. She stared at it, expression steady, though a single muscle in her jaw twitched. For the first time in years, Captain Erin Maddox hesitated before following protocol. She recorded the entry in her private log, date, time, directive summary, then locked the file under restricted access. Her reflection in the dark screen looked unfamiliar, the kind of face that begins to understand what it means to choose between lawful and right. Outside, the sun climbed over the ridgeline, flattening shadows and washing color from the landscape. The day began as it always did: drills, reports, movement, but beneath the order and precision, a current of unease lingered, thin, invisible, and spreading. As the wind pushed dust across the runway, Maddox stood by the window, reading the directive one last time before shutting it down. She memorized every line, every coded phrase, every omission. Then she deleted the message from the network but kept it alive in her mind, a quiet defiance that no system could erase. Tomorrow, she would verify it through channels. Tonight, she would carry its weight alone. The hum of the bass resumed, steady and disciplined. But the silence that followed carried something new, the sound of doubt awakening. Night pressed down on the desert like a held breath. Under the floodlights, the bass glowed pale and unnatural, its edges lost to the dust that drifted beyond the perimeter fence. Every structure seemed sharper under the glare, too clean, too arranged, as though someone wanted control not just of the mission, but of the illusion of order itself. Captain Erin Maddox stood on the observation deck above the motor pool, clipboard under her arm, headset draped around her neck. Below, convoys idled with their lights off, waiting for a signal that hadn't come. She could feel the hum of the diesel engines through her boots, routine on the surface. Yet, beneath it, movement that didn't fit the rhythm she knew. Civilian contractors, men she'd never seen before, walked freely between restricted zones. Their badges reflected the floodlight glare, but their uniforms were wrong. No name tapes, no rank, no branch insignia. Just that same reversed flag patch, its stripes leading backward into the dark. She checked her watch. 23:45 hours. The operation manifest said all civilian personnel should have cleared the motor pool by 2100. She noted the discrepancy, marking it in her log with the same detached precision she used for every irregularity. But as she wrote, her pen pressed harder against the paper. Inside the operations center, the air was thick with heat and static. The comms channels were stacked with chatter, coded, sterile, disciplined. Maddox keyed through the encryption layers until she reached the priority channel, the one tied to the order from the night before. The same directive appeared again, duplicated and time-stamped. This time, it carried a signature Call Marcus Dwyer, acting command authority. Except Lieutenant Colonel Dwyer was on leave, his last location confirmed in Okinawa. Maddox knew because she'd processed his travel clearance 2 weeks prior. The system listed him as active, yet no one in the chain acknowledged it. The data was being overwritten in real time. She leaned closer to the console, tracing the signal path. It rerouted through an unregistered node outside the Marine communication grid, a private relay. The digital fingerprint carried the same encryption style used by defense contractors. It wasn't the Marine Corps. It was something pretending to be. Through the thin wall of the comms bay, she heard boots echoing down the hall. Deliberate, synchronized. A team passed by, gear clinking, rifles slung low. Not a patrol rotation. They were moving toward the holding cells on the far side of the compound. Her chest tightened. She opened the classified order again, scrolling to the end. The language had changed. It now referenced clearance for termination of compromised intelligence personnel. It didn't use the word execution, but the intent was clear. Worse, the new order bore a secondary clearance tag, Joint Operational Directive 47C, a document she had never seen before, bearing no Marine authentication. She requested verification from higher command. The response returned almost instantly. Command verified. Proceed as directed. No name. No rank. Just approval from a void. The hum of the monitors filled the silence. Maddox's pulse slowed, her breathing shallow but steady. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. She'd seen falsified documents before, small-scale clerical deceptions. This was different. This was systemic. The kind of corruption that hid behind precision and formality, where every line of procedure was weaponized to look legitimate. She left the comms bay, stepping back into the open air. The base felt colder now. The wind had picked up, carrying the faint metallic scent of rain on dust. Along the northern fence, floodlights flickered once, then steadied. The contractors had gathered near the supply hangar, unloading crates under the supervision of a senior staff sergeant, one who answered directly to the base commander, Colonel Haynes. Haynes had built his reputation on discipline and compliance, but over the past week, his orders had taken on a clipped, unfamiliar tone, mechanical, detached. Maddox remembered his last briefing. No questions, no delays, command authority confirmed. Yet, even as he said it, his eyes had avoided hers. She moved through the admin wing, observing without interrupting. Office doors closed faster than usual when she passed. The usual nods of acknowledgement from subordinates were replaced with guarded silence. In the talk, the main map of operational zones had been cleared from the board. No sitreps posted, no activity logs displayed. Everything that gave the base its rhythm, its transparency, had been erased overnight. By 100 hours. Maddox sat alone in her quarters, the room dimly lit by the screen glow of her private log. Each entry grew more precise, more incriminating. She listed timestamps, personnel movements, the contractor's unverified access codes. Then she opened the classified order once more, breaking down its metadata, cross-referencing command hierarchies. The signature verification failed 3 times. She stared at the failure notice, invalid certificate authority, and felt the line between lawful and criminal blur. For a Marine, obedience wasn't optional, but obedience built on false command wasn't duty, it was surrender. The next realization came quietly. Colonel Haynes wasn't acting on behalf of the Marine Corps. He was executing orders routed through private command, likely a contracted intelligence firm operating under classified clearance. The base, her base, had been co-opted. She leaned back, eyes tracing the ceiling lines, listening to the low mechanical hum that filled the room. Even the air conditioning sounded different, steady, relentless, unnatural. Every system humming in false harmony. Her composure didn't break. Not yet. But her focus sharpened. She encrypted her log and backed it up to a secure local drive, labeling it under routine systems data. She copied the unverified order into the same file, proof of an unseen chain pulling at the fabric of lawful command. Outside, the floodlights dimmed as the generators cycled down. Somewhere across the compound, a loud metallic clang broke the quiet, a gate locking, a signal closing the perimeter. Captain Erin Maddox stood, straightened her uniform, and looked out toward the far lights of the holding area. Tomorrow, at 600 hours, the directive would be carried out. She didn't yet know what form it would take, but she intended to see it herself. In the mirror beside her bunk, her reflection looked steady, almost indifferent. But, behind the calm surface, something irreversible had shifted, a readiness that came not from orders, but from conscience. The base returned to silence, the floodlights hummed, and somewhere beyond the fence, the desert wind whispered through the wires, the sound of command gone wrong. The desert night was neither quiet nor alive. It vibrated with the hum of generators, the low mechanical rhythm that blurred the line between life and machine. Floodlights cut through the dust, turning the air metallic and pale. Every sound carried too far. The creak of wood, the scuff of boots, the soft clang of hardware echoing across the compound. Against that artificial brightness stood a single wooden beam, roughly assembled, its shape unmistakable. The rope hung heavy from its crossbar, coiled neatly on the ground below, its fibers new and untouched by time. The image didn't belong to this century, yet here it stood, improvised but deliberate, sanctioned by no lawful order. Captain Erin Maddox stood at the edge of the tarmac, clipboard in hand, posture straight, face unreadable. Her eyes swept the area methodically, cataloging the scene as if it were another inspection. But inside, her breathing slowed, every inhale stretching longer, quieter, calculated. Duty required stillness. Conscience demanded notice. The floodlights hummed, throwing elongated shadows that merged into one another. Contractors moved with silent efficiency, unrolling cables, setting up barriers, marking zones with fluorescent tape. Each motion followed a practiced rhythm, not military, but procedural in its own cold precision. The Marines assigned to base security stood apart, uncertain, their faces dim behind visors. They watched without speaking. They obeyed without understanding. The air smelled of cordite and dry dust. Somewhere nearby, fuel burned low in a generator tank. The night pressed heavy against the floodlight glow, and beyond it, the desert swallowed sound whole. Maddox took in every detail: the alignment of vehicles, the direction of the wind, the number of personnel, as if inventory could anchor morality. At 0100 hours, a transport truck rolled in from the northern gate. 2 Marines dismounted, flanking a woman in restraints. Her uniform was immaculate, the rank insignia visible even in the harsh light. Lieutenant Sarah Dean. Her expression was steady, unflinching, but her pace betrayed fatigue. She moved like someone walking through a dream that no longer made sense. Maddox's chest tightened. Dean had been part of the intelligence division. Quiet, analytical, meticulous. The accusation listed in the unauthorized directive had labeled her compromised. That word, more than any, had haunted Maddox. It was the language of bureaucracy pretending to be justice. The contractors directed the Marines without words, pointing, signaling, orchestrating. One adjusted the rope, testing the knot's weight against the beam. Another set up a small camera on a tripod, red light blinking, documentation, not ceremony. Everything about it was official in appearance, unlawful in essence. Maddox stood 10 yards away, her boots grounded in the sand, clipboard pressed tight to her chest. The paperwork she carried, her authorization manifest, was empty. It served only as camouflage, her last thread of belonging to a command structure that no longer existed. She turned her gaze to Colonel Haynes. He stood apart, hands clasped behind his back, his uniform crisp, his eyes locked on the scene with a vacant detachment. When he nodded, it wasn't approval, it was surrender. The authority that should have anchored the night had hollowed itself out. Maddox's heartbeat slowed until she could hear each pulse in her ears. Her mind cataloged the facts: unauthorized personnel, falsified command chain, extrajudicial punishment under covert authority. Every line of protocol she'd ever memorized was being inverted before her eyes. But she did not move. Not yet. The Marine detail remained still, unsure whether to salute or avert their eyes. The wind shifted, pushing dust across the floodlights, dimming the scene for a brief second. Maddox inhaled through her nose, a small, controlled motion. Her hands remained steady, but her thoughts had already crossed a line. Dean stood beneath the beam, the rope now taut above her. Her eyes lifted once toward the stars, then down again. No plea, no resistance, only silence. Maddox focused on the rope itself, the twist of its fibers, the way it caught light. It looked impossibly clean, unweathered, as if crafted only for this moment. The beam creaked softly as tension settled into it. Inside Maddox's chest, something gave way. Not emotion, not panic, but recognition. There are moments, she thought, when silence is no longer discipline but complicity. The soundscape narrowed, the generator hum receded, even the wind seemed to pause. She could feel the weight of decision pressing against her ribs, a pressure both moral and physical. The voice of her training spoke first. Observe, do not interfere, maintain chain of command. Then came the other voice, quieter, older, truer. This is not command, this is control. Her right hand tightened around the clipboard until her knuckles paled. She took one step forward, subtle, unnoticed. The line between observer and participant blurred, every nerve in her body aligned toward motion. Though reason restrained her, she could not act without proof, without timing, without consequence. But she knew, irrevocably, that the next act of silence would define her forever. Colonel Haynes gave a small signal. A contractor moved toward the mechanism. The scene was ready. Maddox's breathing slowed further. The world around her flattened into imagery, the sway of the rope, the glow of sodium light, the still posture of the condemned. She wasn't afraid. She was awake. For the first time. Every protocol, every oath, every piece of doctrine aligned toward one truth. That duty without conscience is no duty at all. The contractor reached for the lever. Maddox's heart struck once. Heavy. She felt her throat tighten, air pulling thin. Her body leaned forward slightly, every instinct poised between obedience and action. And then, sound. A metallic clatter from beyond the wall, faint but distinct. The echo of an approaching vehicle. The timing was impossibly precise. The floodlights flickered once, as if the desert itself had drawn breath. The execution detail froze, waiting for instruction. Haynes turned his head, uncertain. Maddox's eyes narrowed. The external interruption hadn't arrived yet, but its shadow already touched the scene. She shifted her stance, left foot forward, shoulders squared, clipboard lowering slightly. The motion was small, deliberate, irreversible. Her decision was made. The hum of generators rose again, louder, deeper, filling the silence left by hesitation. Maddox didn't move further. She didn't need to. The next step, she knew, would not be hers alone. The night held still, rope taut, dust suspended, conscience caught mid-breath. The desert waited for the sound of authority. And Captain Erin Maddox, standing between order and humanity, crossed the line within herself. The moment silence became impossible. Engines approached like thunder wrapped in discipline, a low, synchronized growl rolling across the desert. Headlights cut through the haze, slicing the floodlight glare with beams of clean, unwavering light. Dust rose in slow spirals around the convoy, the particles glinting in the white wash as if the air itself recognized the return of order. Every sound on the base stopped. The hum of generators faltered beneath the roar. Boots froze, hands stilled mid-motion. The contractors turned first, faces half-lit and uncertain. Marines followed, instinct tightening their posture. The night, moments from collapse, held itself in suspension. Captain Erin Maddox stood at the edge of the scaffold field, clipboard still against her chest. Heart steady now. The fear that had lived in her breath for hours changed shape. No longer panic, but readiness. The dust whipped across her uniform, catching the dull gleam of her name tape as she faced the oncoming light. The convoy slowed to a crawl. 3 vehicles, tactical transports, stopped in a straight line just beyond the perimeter lights. Engines idled once, then cut. The silence afterward was almost holy. Out of the lead vehicle stepped Colonel James Kellen. He didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. His presence filled the space with something larger than command, a gravity built from years of earned authority. His uniform bore the marks of travel, not ceremony. The desert wind caught the edge of his field cap, tilting its shadow across his face. He paused, scanning the scene, the scaffold, the rope, the gathered ranks. For a moment, no one moved, no orders were shouted, no gestures made. Yet every man and woman there felt the same shift, the invisible line between false authority and the real thing being redrawn in the sand. Colonel Kellen stepped forward. His boots ground against the gravel, measured, unhurried. The faint creak of leather straps was the only sound. He passed through the ring of floodlight haze and into full illumination, revealing the calm beneath his eyes, a stillness that radiated control. The contractors nearest the scaffold stiffened. Their weapons hung low, unsure of their purpose now. The Marines, those who had stood watching in moral paralysis, began to square their shoulders again, their bearing instinctively correcting under true command. Maddox watched as Kellen came to a stop beneath the beam. The rope swung faintly in the wind, brushing against his shoulder as he looked up at it. The motion was almost reverent, like a priest examining the remains of a sin. Lieutenant Sarah Dean stood several feet away, her wrists still bound. The red glare of the recording light from the contractor's camera blinked against her face. Kellen's gaze moved once to her restraints, then to Colonel Haynes, who stood rigid near the edge of the platform, his expression unreadable but already unraveling. The air thickened. It wasn't loudness that commanded the night now. It was silence. A silence that belonged to discipline, not fear. Kellen's presence was enough. No words had been spoken yet, but the meaning was clear. This was over. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with volume but with certainty. The command, only 2 words, carried farther than sound should have allowed. Stand down. It was not a request. It was a restoration. The response came like a slow exhale. Marines lowered their rifles. Contractors hesitated, then stepped back. The red camera light dimmed as someone reached forward to shut it off. The generator hum steadied again, finding a rhythm that sounded almost human. Kellen moved closer to the scaffold, one gloved hand resting on the rope. He studied it. The fibers, the knot, the weight. Then, without ceremony, he drew a knife from his belt and cut it. The rope fell, coiling softly in the sand. The sound it made, a muted thud, felt like absolution. No one clapped. No one spoke. It wasn't a moment for triumph. It was correction, the reassertion of moral gravity. Colonel Haynes remained still, every breath visible in the harsh light. Maddox could see the calculation in his eyes' exposure. Consequence. Collapse. Kellen didn't look at him. He didn't need to. Authority had already reclaimed the space he'd tried to control. Maddox stood anchored in that light, her uniform streaked with dust. The tightness in her chest finally loosened. Her gaze met Kellen's for an instant. No words, no acknowledgement, just understanding. She had held the line until integrity arrived. The air smelled of diesel and ozone. The floodlights flickered once, settling into steady illumination. Marines moved again, methodical now, clearing equipment, re-establishing perimeter discipline. The ritual of obedience had returned, but this time, anchored to legitimacy. Kellen stepped back from the scaffold, his boots sinking slightly in the sand. Behind him, the vehicles idled low, headlights still cutting faint beams through the lingering haze. He gave a small nod toward the Marines nearest the condemned officer. They released her restraints quietly. Maddox's eyes followed the motion of the rope on the ground, now severed and harmless. The symbol of control reduced to nothing more than cord and dust. It would stay there for a while, a reminder of how close discipline had come to turning against itself. The wind shifted again. Cooler now, the temperature dropping as the desert exhaled. For the first time in hours, the night sounded like it should. Open, vast, indifferent, but free. Colonel Kellen turned toward his convoy, the briefest glance sweeping the faces of those assembled. There was no speech, no reprimand, no declaration. His silence carried more authority than any order could. Maddox felt the meaning settle in her bones. Command isn't given by title, it's carried by conscience. As the convoy engines reignited, their light spilled one last time across the scaffold, over the rope, across the sand that had absorbed so much silence. Then they turned, moving slowly toward the perimeter, leaving order in their wake. The floodlights dimmed. The hum returned to its steady monotone. Captain Erin Maddox remained where she was, unmoving, the clipboard at her side. Around her, the base breathed again, its heartbeat returning to rhythm. The night had been reclaimed, not by force, but by presence. The rope lay still in the sand, cut clean, its shadow stretching east toward the horizon. And in that silence, Maddox understood that justice doesn't shout. It walks in quietly and stands where it must. The dust hung in the air long after the engines had gone quiet. Floodlights hummed faintly, their glow dimmed to half intensity, throwing soft halos across the empty scaffold. The rope lay in the sand, frayed where it had been severed. Wind moved gently through it, lifting grains of dust that shimmered in the pale light before falling again. The night felt lighter, but not clean, like a wound closed without healing. Captain Erin Maddox stood near the perimeter fence, her silhouette faint against the cooling metal of a Humvee. The last of Colonel Kellen's convoy was assembling, engines warming in the distance. She watched as the Marines moved with quiet precision, re-establishing normalcy one motion at a time. The sound of gear locking into place, boots brushing gravel, diesel engines idling, every noise felt subdued, respectful, like ritual after confession. The scaffold remained untouched. No one would approach it until morning. Its presence spoke enough, the physical evidence of where duty had turned inward on itself. The wind carried the faint scent of diesel and iron, mixing with the dry cold of the desert. Maddox breathed it in slowly, feeling the ache behind her sternum that came when adrenaline ebbed and consequence took its place. Her gaze dropped to the sand at her feet. Something caught the light, a small scrap of fabric, half buried. She knelt, brushing dust aside until it revealed the torn flag patch. The stars still faced backward, the stripes reaching into shadow. She turned it over in her palm. The Velcro edge was frayed, the colors muted by dirt. Whatever meaning it had carried was gone now, the symbol reclaimed only by what it no longer represented. She closed her hand around it, standing slowly. The convoy began to roll forward, headlights carving thin beams through the haze. Colonel Kellen rode in the lead vehicle, his outline still and composed. He didn't look back. Command didn't need to. Maddox turned toward the command post. Inside, the fluorescent light buzzed against the silence. She opened a new sitrep file and typed the first line: intervention at 0130 hours. Unauthorized order neutralized. Lawful authority restored. Then, after a long pause, she added 3 more words: integrity maintained. Cost accepted. Outside, the convoy's lights disappeared into the desert. The hum of the generators steadied. The base exhaled. Captain Erin Maddox stood alone in the quiet, the torn patch still in her hand, a reminder that justice had weight, and sometimes it left a mark. What stays with you after it's over isn't the noise. It's the silence that follows. The moment when your hands stop shaking and you realize you're still here, standing where others fell. Captain Lillian Rhodes learned that survival isn't the reward. It's the responsibility. She carried the weight of orders that never came, of truths no one wanted written, and somehow turned that emptiness into endurance. Maybe that's what strength really is, doing the next right thing when no one's watching. Tell me what you'd have done when the signal went dead. I read everyone. If her story reminded you that calm can cut through chaos, hit subscribe and stay close. Share this with someone who still believes silence means surrender, because the mission never ends. It just changes shape. The fire's out. The dust is settling. But the debrief isn't over. Stay in the fight.